Good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are on the world here. I'm very thrilled to be able to speak about Harbour, an open source alternative to Visual Fox Pro. Thank you for being here. We are going to go to different sections of the white paper. I'm going to follow most of the white paper, its direction. I'm not going through a PowerPoint slide. And after each major section, Rick will be able to tell me any kind of questions that you have. So feel free to put questions in the open Slack chat area, and we'll go through there. So let's speak quickly about me, so you can see my bona fide. I am a very long time Visual Fox Pro developer. I come from Belgium 30 years ago here in the United States. I now live in Seattle. Just got hired a few months ago with a very large company here in Seattle, really enjoying that experience. But most of my career, I was a consultant, run a small Fox Pro, Visual Fox Pro mainly company, and also did quite a bit of Python development. Most of my development was in large ERP desktop apps, so I'm very used to Visual Fox Pro apps, and also a large, very large web app creating using Visual Fox Pro as the back end of it. I consider myself a database architect, since I mainly design system first, and then luckily I can use Visual Fox Pro to implement some of those designs. I was one of the board members of the San Diego Fox Pro Developers Network, so I had a chance and the opportunity to be amongst Visual Fox Pro developers for a long time. I developed since Fox Pro 1. Single license, single user, meaning not even multi-user at that point yet, and up till VFP 9, and I actually still use it. Still today, I did use a little bit of VFP 9, although, as I said, last 3 years at my previous employment at San Diego, I was developing in Harbour, which I didn't even know existed, and we'll be going through that particular language. So let's go to introductions right away. The introductions basically will be a series of questions. I was saying this is the best way to cover what Harbour is. So Harbour is an open source implementation of the xBase language, which is compatible, which is basically, I would call, a superset of the C language. It's a 4GL language that will have syntax similar to Visual Fox Pro, or Fox Pro, and will internally generate pure C code. It is open source, and I will actually show you some of the source code of Harbour itself. It runs 32-bit, 64-bit, basically anywhere where C exists, it can run. It came as the result of the Clipper language. So originally we had DBase, which then forked with Foxbase. I did do some Fox-based development too, not a lot, but a little bit. And the Clipper were basically the compilation version of the Fox-based platform. Clipper was a closed source code language company, and when they got bought out a few times, the investors behind left, so many of the developers around the world, mainly in East Europe, and in South America, a lot of them there, decided to actually clone all the features of Clipper. But this actually changed quite a bit in the 20 years or so of its existence. A lot of re-engineering was done in the language. So all of the more modern features, including object-oriented development, including web support, all the web protocols, sockets, HTML are there, but there are some major differences with VFP, especially since it's not limited to 32-bit and not limited to just Windows. And also, it's multi-threaded. So basically, since Harbour will generate pure C code, you can do anything that can be done in C. So I already mentioned a little bit where it comes from. As I mentioned, it comes from the Clipper world. Some people in the Harbour community still are trying to stick to Clipper a lot. Not so much anymore. There was a little history about in the Clipper world, at one point there was a group of developers that really wanted to go beyond the boundaries of Clipper, and they created something called Harbour, which was commercially driven endeavor, but still open source. A little bit kind of like X#, I guess, and but kind of fizzled out. The main writers behind Harbour, they still supposedly are there, but most of the new development disappeared. And I guess the Harbour core developers decided to take upon themselves and reincorporate every new idea that Harbour had into Harbour. There is currently, at one point, there was another fork of Harbour that existed by one of the core developer. Yeah, he wanted to enhance some item in there, but most of the changes again from there got merged back into the regular Harbour. By the way, again, Harbour is a little joke on the fact that it comes from Clipper, so they want to stay very nautical in the world. Harbour with a U. Again, most of the core developers are from Europe. The person who really pushed for the creation of Harbour is actually from Spain, but the core developers are from Poland, Hungary, and also from India. So, how come most people never heard of it? Well, all of the developers are coders. Coders are not really marketing people. They don't really know how to promote themselves. I know that companies like Alaska Software with xBase++ were very good at showing their existence. The funny stuff is when I was aware of xBase++, I didn't know the Harbour existed yet, never heard of it. And everything basically that xBase++, Harbour, all of those features are inside of Harbour itself, except Harbour is fully open source, all platform, and 64-bit. And I must really strike the fact that having that freedom is a big difference. I was missing some features like case insensitivity in the str_tran. Looked at the CC source code, made a new function, cloned it, make some tweak, and now I've got the str_tran with the extra flags that we have in VFP. So it can be changed, which is wonderful, or added to it. So how does it compare with VFP? As I had mentioned before, it is open source. By the way, one of the main reasons that many people, many developers tell me that we kind of have two worlds. We have the US market and the rest of the world, especially the developing world, where being able to afford very expensive software is not an option. Being able to code everything you need, that's what they do. And a lot of C-level developers exist there. That's why Harbour is such an enormous language in comparison to all of the other ones I know of. Now, it has some shortcomings. I'll be straightforward. It was very hard for me to deal with it at first. The beauty of VFP is it's one package that can deal with everything. It has a nice CLI, the command window. It has a nice form builder, class builder, the visual inheritance. Very simple to deal with the tables. Basically, all the richness that we know about VFP. But there are shortcomings to it, of course. Some of them might be very minor, but UTF support, Unicode support, not obvious to be able to work around that in VFP. That's basically in Harbour to start with. Because it is created internationally, all of that is part of the language. One of the major shortcomings, like all the other X languages, like I think X#, xBase++, are basically some of the lack of the local SQL engine. Now, at first, I thought that Harbour also did not have cursors, but actually it had it. But like I mentioned before, all of this is created by developers that sometimes have a hard time communicating what exists. I was able to find that you can do in-memory tables. Actually, there are a couple of ways. And I'm going to show how actually the Foxpro cursors exist in Harbour, and actually how we can create all the SQL engine currently with backend systems, backend databases, currently working on incorporating SQLite to kind of being the equivalent of the Harbour, the VFP local SQL syntax. But for those like me who are basically using all either MySQL, PostgreSQL, sometimes Microsoft SQL and Oracle, the main feature that we need is being able to run a SQL remotely. Although I must say I daily use subsequent local SQL statements. The richness it gives is just fantastic. There are some work around it. I'll go through that later on. Now the IDE. VFP has the wonderful IDE that we have. Luckily, until a year and a half ago, most Harbour developers were using Notepad++, I guess some Vim, multi-edit, it's another Windows. And then there were a few commercial vendors that existed out there, one called Xalier, which provides some IDE. There was an open source HB IDE, another open source project was created by one of the core developers of Harbour. But they were all, how would I be? They were more like bona fide text editor with not too much bells and whistles, and the debugging was not very easy. Luckily, an Italian developer created a whole extension for VS Code. Most Visual developers don't know about VS Code, but for those of us who have to develop in all the languages, I developed quite a bit in Python. I did some C#, although there we can use the Visual Studio, some Node, and some Go. Also, I played lately with some Go as well. So VS Code is one of the most fantastic editors and IDE at the same time. So you kind of started as an IDE, as an editor, and you beef it up to become an IDE. It's an IDE because mainly it has the debugger built in. All of the examples I'm going to go through all rely on VS Code. I have a lot of technical articles that go through Harbour. All of them basically require to use VS Code. I did in the past use some other debuggers that some developers created for Harbour. I found them, first of all, to be text-oriented, not really mouse-driven and not as easy to handle. Because VS Code has so many extensions, like bookmarking, like local GitHub. I'll go through some of those extensions, but a lot of them can be taken advantage inside of Harbour as well. So, and another major advantage of Harbour is its performance. All generates down to C. The speed of it is insane. I will go through some example about concatenating strings later on. It's going to be mind-boggling. Many other languages are coded like in C++. That's usually 20 to 40% slower. But in comparison to VFP, we're speaking about tenfold or more in many areas in performance. I know that for development, what is most important is development speed and also the perception that the user gets. But when you have to develop your application as a web app, or like some Harbour developers now are actually deploying in the cloud, like in AWS environment, processing time is actually real dollar amounts. So it does matter. One of the extensions, one of the open source projects I also created, which I will go briefly through, is a web framework for Harbour based upon the FastCGI protocol, which is very old, but really good. Basically, you create Harbour programs that are managed by the web server, which are on standby to respond pages. The current Harbour website, the Harbour wiki I have, will roughly build around 15 to 30 pages per second. It can handle quite a bit of load per course. The equivalent of that in a Harbour, like a Hello World kind of test, Harbour on the Unix box, you get around 2,000 responses per second. Since FastCGI are different executables that the server will automatically fork and start in multiple instances of them depending on the capacity of your servers, it really scales up. So again, one of the major advantages of the Harbour language is there are actually a few now web solutions out there that are all open source. So how does Harbour also compare to other languages? Actually, I created a whole article. I will not go through that in detail on the wiki, so feel free to go there. I tried to, this is an article I created when I was trying to really bring up to light to the Harbour community some of the wonderful things VFP has. Now, some of those, as I said, I did not realize Harbour had, like cursors. And I didn't realize some of the features it had, because even where I was working before for 3 years, it was basically maintaining and updating an already existing site, so that I never had to go on the outside boundaries of it until I decided to actually get really deep into Harbour. But this article will compare VFP and Harbour, but also against Python, against C#, against Node, and some other languages. They're all listed there, all the pros and cons. All articles also link back to a Google group that have discussions. So very often the articles I post, they strike a conversation amongst a lot of Harbour developers. There's a actually a couple of Google forums for Harbour, one for the main users. We have over 60,000 messages, posts on there. I usually go to that place to find many of the answers, and I will show you a tool to actually look that up. Okay, so what could Harbour could be used for? At first, Harbour was used as a desktop development product like Clipper. Since it's so old, most people were just doing local shop applications. Now that changed, first of all, with its enhancement to add object-oriented development, web development, and also COM support. For example, Alaska Software doesn't let you create a COM object, to my knowledge, still. Harbour, open source, we can create COM objects, 32-bit, 64-bit. I wrote an article also about it. I'm going to speak later on about it, about interoperability between Harbour and other languages like Visual Fox Pro. But it can be a consumer of COM object if you are running on a Windows platform or a server. So many of these features are not readily easy to find until you dig yourself through the Harbour core repo or again some discussion board. And my goal is to really help the Harbour community and the VFP community to find all those resources and to explain them in plain English where to find them and how to work on them, so step-by-step guides. So how does Harbour work? This is a quick overall idea of it. VFP has some compilation. It creates the FXPs or the app and some EXEs too. But VFP relies on quite a few DLL, and it has basically a virtual machine kind of its own, which reads the P code, semi-P code that FXP has inside. And even the EXE that we create in Fox Pro don't actually execute your FXP or app or EXE. It actually loads the bootstrapper of the VFP virtual machine that would then either read the internals of your FXPs or app or EXEs. Harbour is a different beast. It basically generates pure C code. Now, there are different ways it can generate C code. The default one is that it has also a virtual machine, which is not outside of your EXE. So when you build an EXE or DLL, you can actually have the virtual machine, which is basically a big C routine, inside your EXE itself. So at the end, when you make a Harbour program, you create single standalone EXEs with everything into them. Now, of course, if you deploy on Unix, it can be a little bit different. I found one small exception when we create 32-bit DLLs, I think, using Ming, the Ming compiler. Then we need an extra DLL for that. It is in the documentation I have on the wiki. That's just due to the C compiler. But Harbour is basically a series of a preprocessor, kind of like we could remember in VFP we had the SCXs can be created, or the old SCXs can be created by some drivers we had that would make some other DBFs SCX-likes, and then we would generate our final programs. Harbour is basically have a preprocessor. Now, Harbour follows a lot of the concept of C. C has a preprocessor too, that it can do the pound defines and the other compilation directives. But Harbour has its own preprocessor, which has a lot of additional features, including something called pound x command or x translate. There's also a pound command and a pound translate. They basically allow you to substitute functions or entire commands and translate them to whatever else you want. So you could, for example, add extra parameters, swap parameters, change the whole text. And when you have your PRG, and if you load an include file that has those commands and translate, you can completely transform your language. So you could, I even saw a person who wrote a COBOL program with COBOL syntax, and it at the end transformed itself into Harbour code. Pretty wild. But I am using some of those advanced features of Harbour to recreate the scan and scan. I couldn't believe it, but Harbour did not have a scan and scan. They said, yeah, you can do a scan and scan with a simple translate, but the problem is most Harbour developers did not realize that when a scan occurs, when you come back and you loop back through it, it resets the work area to whatever the work area had when you come in. That didn't work properly, so in the repo I have the necessary features to work around that. Again, I could do that because of the preprocessor. Also, one fantastic feature of the preprocessor is its ability to switch over to pure C code, to something called a pragma directive. You can be writing PRG code, and in the middle of it, oh, I want to call some Windows API. You can actually, in the middle of the PRG, switch to C, do some include of some Windows libraries, and go back to PRG. At the end, the preprocessor will merge, actually no, the real processor will take those and put them into the final C file. But the preprocessor will also process some of those. So this is, for example, an example of a hybrid, which I will go through that later. I will show in the example. Let's go to the Harbour compiler directly. So when you call the compiler, it calls its preprocessor. It generates an intermediate PRG-like files, which I will show you that you can actually see. But Harbour internally doesn't have commands like, pack, append blank. All of those becomes function like DB. It's become like DB append, not append blank. So, but you can write append blank in your code. So you can write almost all the commands that VFP has. But the compiler will transform those first into the equivalent of a functions. It keeps all of that in memory, but you can actually flag it to actually show you the equivalent of what he has in memory as a .ppo file, preprocessor output, I guess, file. And then those are transformed into then C code. And depending on which C compiler you use, the final object binary files are created. I created a whole diagram about it. If you have some time, maybe later I'll show you, but it's all the different steps and pathway that Harbour takes to take your PRG and C code and do the final EXEs and DLL. It was a little bit confusing for me at first because we are speaking about preprocessors and P code, and there's, by the way, another P code called the Harbour runtime HRB file. Actually, that's what they are called. But they've also got a Harbour runtime library, and so we have the virtual machine. And a standby library of all of the usual functions, but we also have HRB files, which are kind of like the FoxPro FXP files. So it has that, but very few people use that. It was, I guess, created when people were trying to do more of a CLI. This was before VS Code made it very easy to do some testing. And also I have now a playground, a web-based app, kind of like a GS Fiddle, kind of, for Harbour, where you can put a few pieces of code and actually see what happens. But it has also the FXP-like command. Harbour, basically, again, it is a object-oriented, data-centric language, which also can handle functional programming language features, kind of coming from Lisp. But most people don't do that, but you could. The make tool, so when you, in VFP again, we have this fantastic advantage of being able to do a project and to build a exe or DLL app from there. Harbour doesn't have that. Originally, many Harbour developers would use the make C tool to make it work, where in the make tool, they will call the Harbour compiler to create the C files, and then the CMake file will do the object file and so on. I must tell you, I used that for 3 years where I was before. It is very hard. Luckily, another genius of the Harbour community created the own Harbour make tool called HBMK2, which I use all the time, and I rely all the time on it. Now, in all the examples, I actually created DOS batch files that will automate all the process, but internally it called the HBMK2. But instead of using our project file, we have to use a text file, or we can use a series of text files to actually say what files we want to bind in, how they are being processed and linked together. There's good documentation about that. That's a wonderful thing. Now, the source code of HBMK2 file is very complicated, I must admit. A little overwhelming, so I actually don't really touch at it, but it's a very mature product. Harbour by itself, it is extremely mature. It's used around the world. Not a huge number of developers, but they're being used by some very large apps. Where I was working, we had at one point 12 million developers, users using that. So it is not a small solution. It is serious enterprise-grade language and tool set. So with the make tool, again, HBMK2 can be used, or I speak about that on the wiki, and in all of the GitHub repos I have, I make it very easy to use and build. Just so you know, I was mentioning about the complexity of the compiler process. This is very, very small font. You can go look at it if you want on the wiki. I start from PRG files all the way to EXEs and all different pathways we can do. As I said, it took quite a bit of time to understand it. I'll be always here if you have any questions about it. Most of the Harbour developers were there for the Clipper time. They don't have a lot of new Harbour developers, again, lack of advertisement of the language. So most of them already take it for, for face value that everything it does. I came from VFP. I had no clue how it worked, so I had to go through the hard lesson of learning it. I'm hoping that through the wiki and me presenting this, it will help you out. Okay, at this point I will stop. This was a long section. I'm really sorry about that. So Rick, if you have any questions, this is a good time for me to respond.
Okay, just a couple questions that weren't answered by the people who were asking them. They were reading ahead in your white paper and answering your own questions. Robert's asking, I see approximately 10 commits this year. How active is the Harbour development?
The Harbour core development is very low currently. You're correct. There is a lack of main program documentation, which I am working on. I am in contact with the core developers and even the creator, the original creator of the language, Antonio Linares, and a few of the other developers. You can see them on the board. We are working at making it easier to add a language. As I said, I can go through it. Currently, I don't see a lot of new features to be added to it. To be honest with you, I don't know where or what could be added to the language. Virtually everything that is needed for the language is being done by external contribs, like the whole web support. Antonio Linares was working on something called a mod Harbour, which is basically an Apache module that would do kind of like PHP does for Harbour, when you can create your PRG files, and like in PHP, you open source file and it runs them on the fly. That was created for the Apache platform. I did not find it to be high performance enough, and I always wanted to do a fast CGI, so I took upon myself to do it. Now there is a third group of developers that made another mod and another fast CGI and a couple of WebSockets. Most of the development is being done outside of the core. Like, as I said, the VS Code project is very active, is being updated regularly. The mod Harbour, the fast CGI are being worked a lot. And I'm going to speak about the brand new, very exciting GUI tool, which is very modern, that is being developed. I've got a few screenshots of that. Most of the development is being done outside of the core. But it is true, I'm trying to document the core. So there are a few features I wish we could add, like in Python has a yield for generators. It could be created in Harbour with static variables. Not as easy, but I'm working at it now for 3 years. I couldn't figure out what to add. As I said, a few things from the VFP world. The one missing thing is a local SQL statement. There was a talk that one of the core developers might do it, but we need some financing for that. But even if that can be done by some of the core developers, as I said, I'm working on integrating it with SQLite. It's open source, so it had a ton of involvement, but a very bad marketing. I hope this answered the question. There are lots of fork, by the way. Lots of fork, meaning that I think there was a session already on Git in our conference, but a lot of people forked Harbour. Some people made some external version. One gentleman actually took the whole Harbour and trimmed out everything that was except the Ming and Microsoft compiler, because the current version can support almost any compiler. I even saw a gentleman who ran Harbour under Objective-C and made an iOS app in Harbour. It's like, okay. So any other questions, Rick?
Yep. A related question that was answered by another person, but the question from Paul was, how can Harbour function without a report engine?
Well, there are a few options. There is a company called Xalier, which is a commercial application, to my knowledge, royalty-free. It is a VFP FoxPro-like product that has a report engine in it. Now, personally, I do all my report through HTML, and you're going to see Harbour is unbelievable in string processing speed. So for building your HTML output is just the best, I would say. It's even faster than Node. I don't know of any other language that is as fast. First, if you do C#, you would have to use the builder class to get something close to the speed of Harbour. But otherwise, all the reports I did were basically in HTML. But yeah, again, that's one of the fantastic thing of VFP. Now we could, to my knowledge, the FoxPro engine, the report engine is, I think, was made open source. That's one of the items Alaska claimed that we have access to it. So in theory, could we make it happen? Yeah, maybe we can have the XFRX people do that. Maybe could be of interest, but currently it doesn't have it natively.
Okay, that's it for now.
All right. So installing Harbour. I would say, because we're already half an hour in this, I may just tell you briefly and go look at the article. I created a Harbour wiki, by the way, as a hopefully a mean to have many people write articles. Sadly, all but one or all articles are created. But if in the future you would like to write some articles, not just of Harbour, but how VFP is and how to integrate Harbour and VFP, please come and join me in that. But I wrote a whole article about installing Harbour. It's a combination of installing Harbour from open source and the C compilers. I think both Ming and Microsoft Studio. You have to install both of those items. There's also a way to actually get pre-built version of Harbour. I know there's another project that goes that builds it nightly, but recently GitHub actually has built-in builders like continuous integration in GitHub. Antonio Linares had created a few of those builders. I took his, I made a fork, and I only focus on the Min compiler, so you can actually pick up the GitHub built version of Harbour there, and as long as you have the latest Min on your local machine, you can do it too. I would highly suggest you to just get a source code, use Git. I go to the step of that, fetch, download. You can or get the zip file, download it, and there's a simple WinMake if you're on Windows, and it builds the whole thing for you. I do it also on Unix. A gentleman from France actually was kind enough to make a fairly long article on building Harbour on Linux. So just go through that. Any questions on this?
No.
Okay. I didn't think so. Using VS Code. All right. Well, let me bring up a copy of VS Code. By the way, I have a whole article about VS Code on Harbour Wiki. It's in the white papers. And I had no clue what VS Code was. Zero. And again, I wrote the article going through the learning phase of it. And I found myself, I go again, even today I developed some VFP ETL code, transformation of some data because it's fast and dirty. As I said, the local SQL is still a big advantage. And the data set was not too big, so I could stay within the constraints of the 32-bit app. But the more I use VS Code, the more it's like, oh God, I wish I had this in VFP. So in this environment, we have, remember I'm mentioning that we don't have projects files. Here we have the equivalent of a project file, which is a text file. This is what the Harbour HBMK2 builder would use. In this case, I will go and use we can go in debug mode or not. I have the single PRG hello Harbour, or all our usual thing, and I'm making an exe file at the end, and I can do what I call an incremental, meaning the system is smart enough to only recompile PRGs it needs to or not. And here's a simple PRG. Every executable should have a function main. We could use privates. It doesn't have private all, but so you can use private, or you choose the private by default. I use locals. I created here an extra function, which is actually a C function. This is what I mean is that I'm in PRG code like here, and here I'm in C code here. So here I have another kind of compiler switching interface, even though this generates pure exe, which can be quite protected. You can actually still, using hex editor, read something. So if you really want your text to not be even hackable or readable easily, you can obfuscate it using this pragma method. Oh, one thing I forgot. You can actually compile your C code without the Harbour virtual machine. The compiler can create C code without it, which then makes the C code much bigger. It can be 2-3 times bigger depending on the size of the program. You will gain 20 to 30% of speed. Not fantastic. Sometimes you won't even gain any speed because the size of the exe is smaller, therefore your memory footprint is smaller. But if you go that way, it's virtually impossible to reverse engineer. If you go the virtual machine way, there are a couple of antivirus programs that try to reverse engineer that version, but doesn't work very well. Here we have our standard loop. By the way, I purposely put a compiler directive. So max loop is here. A good standard when you write Harbour code is any kind of compiler variables. We put them all in uppercase. Harbour is case insensitive by default. So like Fox Pro, it has a little limitation on the 4-character of functions, it likes to have the, instead of Alt-T, we need to go Alt-Trim. I think there's a settings we can do, or we can use a transform to work around that, but I got used to just putting the whole word. Again, camel case, whatever case you want. And then like here we have, this is the equivalent of set step on. Now in VS Code, we could mark and make a debug point, a place to stop. I often like to just put like a hardcore set step on. Those are ignored, like in VFP when you do a final compilation, non-debug mode. Let me see a little bit about the structure of this. Let me bring Explorer. By default, Harbour doesn't have the concept of separating debug versus release version like Visual Studio has. In the framework, in the repos I create all the examples I have, I created that concept. So if I compile on a Ming, I will have a debug version I create. Here's Hello Harbour in debug mode, or a version, you can see it's 1.6 meg because the entire virtual machine is bound into it. So it's not teeny tiny because of that. It's a little bit smaller when I have the debug mode off because the debug library is out of it. But we spoke about the PPO files. These PRG files get generated by the precompiler into a equivalent-like code. But in the PRG, we had the question mark or usual output. That's a command, kind of. So in Harbour, that becomes a function, the QOut. When I do web apps, I change the question mark into the QOut. I change it to a call to a method of the fastCGI library to actually output to HTML instead. Again, you can capture and redirect what those do. And then after the PPO, it will actually create C file. So if I go into, let's say, the debug release, the make file will create a hidden file, a hidden folder. You go really deep in here, and you can actually see. Let me bring this over. This is the C code being generated by Harbour. It is using some C macros. It has something called a symbol table, meaning all of the functions that are not part of the core are added. So even Alt-Trim is not part of the built-in optcode. There are around 150, I believe, bytecode that Harbour has. Alt-Trim is not necessary, but it's there. So because we're using it, it's being bound into it. And this is the equivalent of the FXP that we would have, but instead of FXP, it is a C array, which then the virtual machine is going to execute. So this, you can actually see, hey, it's calling the virtual machine of Harbour. And some other, here's some other inline functions. And I think this was a debugger mode, so it keeps track of some information about when you're debugging where you are. So let me run this. I've got some hotkeys I created on my environment. If I'm doing in build mode, tell me, I don't know what this one is. So I ran the hello Harbour. It compiled and ran it here. If I go in debug mode, I'm going to stop. Oh, I should be on my PRG file here. I think the conference software is making the whole computer a bit slower here. Here it is much faster. And we stopped, and we can see our variable, our local variable here. And we could put watch points, breakpoints. We can, almost like any modern debugger. This is the VS Code debugger, so you betcha that this is a very good debugger since it's used across multiple languages. And you can go in, dig in and so on. So again, you have access to all the files. You have extensions. VS Code has a ton of extensions. This is the Harbour, xHarbour extension I was speaking to you about, that gives a debugger, that gives some syntax highlighting. I have even spell check, so I can spell check my text. I guess maybe if I do, let's see, paused, it detects it's not correct. So the spell checker of VS Code will actually learn and make the difference between code and text you output. Now you may have to train it sometimes, but it is there. I have a lot of different extensions here, like bookmarks, like color coding of parentheses and brackets. I would highly suggest, even if there is actually an extension for VFP, I found that out. Although most people are using the IDE, so it doesn't make too much sense. So let's see. VS Code editing and debugging. And I guess I'm ready for a point. Any questions on this, Rick?
No, they're asking to make the screen larger by switching your camera off.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Thank you for reminding me. All right. So luckily, I didn't go deep into more things. By the way, VS Code, Control Plus, you can make everything bigger. It's a web app. It's made in Electron, which is the same building framework that is used for Teams, Skype, Slack, all of those. So it's basically a web-based interface. Anything else, Rick?
Yeah, what are the Harbour developers using for desktop app, Windows, and interfaces?
I have a section on that. I will go through that. There are multiple options.
That's
okay.
It. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, resource for learning Harbour. I basically kind of don't want to really advertise myself too much, but it is the way it is. I took the time to try to bring as many resources as we can. Go to Harbour Wiki or harbour.dev. Everything is there. One of the first thing I would say is go to the articles. How to install Harbour is here. All the sections, print screens, and everything. Those are really important resources. Links. I try to not overwhelm with links. I try to really focus on what are the most important. One of the most wonderful is an easy startup guide for learning Harbour. This is good already for VFP developers. This is assuming you know how to code already, and it really is go to the basics of Harbour. Must read. Please go through that. By the way, the official Harbour website is defunct. It is not maintained for years. So sadly, if you go to the Google search, Google search, you're going to still find that. Although the wiki is starting to get better and better upon the search engine scores. Hopefully, at one point we can actually redirect that one to just be the wiki or a new foundation we're trying to create amongst the core developers. We are working on that to try to be like Python. So links, go through there. There is an entire section about all this gentleman created a fantastic resource of all of the functions that Harbour has. Now these are alphabetically listed, so it's a little hard to see. Luckily, I am working currently on, in a documentation area, an API. I'm importing all of Pete's documentation inside of the website. So if you want to search everything about arrays. So I currently have all the Harbour specific functions and halfway through some of the other ones. So probably 2-3 weeks from now, all the rest of Pete's doc is going to be in here, at least function-wise. Pete has a few more, if you want to do WebSockets or multi-threading, he has a lot more articles on that. But if you want to see, for example, if you want to deal with an array, you can find the different specification of the array. You can actually see, I don't know, the array, this function is used in one of the PRGs. And I know this is kind of small. Let me make it bigger here. So the Harbour Wiki documentation system will have all of the data from Pete, will code scrape the Harbour source code and some of the other projects and actually let you see some example of each function. And I may have to close this because I increase it afterwards. And also the commit repo. So we can actually see all of the changes that were done for those functions in the repo. As I mentioned earlier, many of the developers were not very good at documenting, except at least document everything into the changelog. Now the changelog is enormous. You can actually download it. It is part of the commits, the repo itself. But I made API to actually read that. And if you're really curious, I'll keep this open. You can actually see the source code, the C source code of the, here for example, is insert into an array. You can see your line 304 to 333. If you want to show all the lines, you can actually see all the other functions defined in a C file. This is one way of looking at the documentation. Another way for those who really want to go deep into the language besides just a quick jump, it's called the Harbour Source Code Explorer, which I created to find all these functions, all these API, and you have a lot of functions. If you thought that FoxPro has a lot of functions, oh my God, Harbour it's even more because of being multi-threading, UTF, Unicode, all web layers. It has so many of them. I'm only scratching the surface of all the function it has. But if I want to find again, and I try to categorize like contribs, those are about what I meant by different extensions that exists, like serial communications, curl. There was an old FoxPro compatibility pack created. This is before I started to make a VFP version. HTTP servers, compression. Because Harbour is in C, it can consume anything in C. So somebody took the entire SQLite and integrated into the language, into one of the contribs. It's absolutely nuts. But it's organized here by files. So the source file in the extras are the C files, the source codes. You can also, if it is documented, you can actually find it documented. This is a good place if you're curious about the internals. And then the third documentation being worked on, it's actually the source code, the kernel, the internal of Harbour. When the person was asking about how the Harbour is being maintained, there's a lack of documentation of how it functions. So that's one of the things that we are working on about how the whole internal Harbour is working, so we can bring more core developers into this. As I said, there's not too many changes to be done, but this is a good place to work on. Links, articles, home, and then one of the things I use all the time is this advanced Google group message query. So currently it's being paused. Google made some changes. I need to fix the code scraper. I create a Python's code scraper that will read the Google group. I will only go to Google group here. I think I already have it here. Here we can see we have people asking questions, and you can see all different answers, how to build whatever this SSL library, how to deal with thread-aware static variables, some question about editors in Wiki. You actually often will see me asking questions in there. I was asking about, hey, is Harbour a functional language or not also? The whole discussion about it. But there are so many searches, but because it's hard to find yourself through it, if you want to find, you can do by search. I want to do VFP. Is there any VFP being spoken about anywhere? And new Harbour VFP company pack repo. I was just announcing that one. Another person is speaking about some VFP. But you can search multiple pieces of text, multiple authors, date ranges. We have a lot. Believe me, I use this all the time. So this should link you back to all the places you need for Harbour. Otherwise, the repo itself has all the contrib and some repo. And there's the official documentation that exists, the Harbour reference guide, and some of the low-level C guides. C code. I would say just go through this. Any questions, Rick?
Yes. Can you compile a FoxPro for Windows project?
No, not natively the way it is. No, this is not a 100% replacement of VFP. It's not. When Alaska Software was claiming they would do that, I was really looking for, why this would be wonderful. Knowing that xBase++ is basically Harbour, but coded in C++ instead of C, where they added a UI, but again, the UI now is made by VS Code. There are, for example, arrays. I have a whole section. I will go through all the different differences between VFP and Harbour. The arrays of Harbour are one-dimension arrays, not like the two-dimension of VFP. But an element of an array can have an array. Very easily, you can create a 3, 4, 5-dimension array if you want in Harbour. And the ASCAN even can be tweaked very easily to be a 2-dimension search in this multi-dimensional array. So the array system, at first I thought that the array of Harbour was weak in comparison to VFP. That was until I realized how it functions internally and how something called code blocks can be used for that, and something called hash arrays. Hash arrays are kind of like the dictionaries of Python. Instead of using array, with position 1 up 1, 2, 3, the indice can be a text, which is wow. I mean, we have kind of that in VFP too as a class, but here's a base object. So no, you cannot take a straight VFP file and bring it there. So I wish it was, believe me, I really do, but no. So you will have some difficulties doing that, but they can be moved over. Most of the logic can be moved over. And there are some techniques you can use by, if some parts cannot be done in Harbour or you don't want to recode them, make a VFP COM objects out of those and call them from within Harbour. Harbour can consume VFP COM objects. Okay. Any other questions?
Just to be clear, he's asking about FoxPro for Windows 2.6, not VFP.
Oh, FoxPro for Windows 2.6? Well, no, because of the FoxPro forms, although Xalier, I think, and there's also another one called HBM Win. I'm going to speak about that. They're very close to the FoxPro syntax, with the @get and the read and so on. So if you're taking a FoxPro 2X DOS Windows, I think those are most likely much easier to move over to Harbour, especially with a few of those GUI options. That, yes. The reports, no. But the Xalier app, I never really went through it. There is a free version of it. I was communicated back by the author of it. They're mainly Spanish-speaking authors, but they do communicate in English, and they have some in English documentation. I would say that might be your best bet. But if you decide to rewrite things, you may as well go full-fledged Harbour and full-fledged web development or web/desktop app. But that depends on what you want to do. But probably it's easier. That's why there was a contrib for FoxPro for Harbour. Okay.
Okay. They're looking forward to more code.
All right. Cool. Okay. Well, I still have to go a little bit through this. I will maybe skip some of the differences in the. Well, let me maybe go to the code. Okay, in a quick view then. Set procedures don't exist because everything gets bound into a single executable. So any method, any procedures that you do anywhere is available everywhere. The one way you would make a function not being reached from everywhere is by adding the static keyword in front of it. So static function, static procedure. Then it makes it localized, kind of like namespacing to a PRG. That's something to have to get used to it. The classes of Harbour are coded a little bit differently. I will go through that to the source code. I mentioned about the arrays already. They are single dimension, but every element of an array can have an array. It's unbelievable what you can do with them. We have hash arrays, which, as I mentioned, is like a key value way of looking at it. The cool thing is you can store hash arrays inside of any element of any array. So I created a hash array that describes a schema where the first level of the hash array is a list of tables. Inside of each table, I have a hash array of field names, and you can make reference of any of the cells by the hash array name, the table name, the field name, and then position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is really cool. I speak about it here. We can have my array table name and field name, and the second I think is the type of the field. The dot is an issue. Like in xBase++, you have to use dash greater than to make the difference. The compiler, because it's not interpretive, kind of like VFP, doesn't know if you're speaking about, what are you speaking about? It has to be that between the field and the first name. The equal sign, most of the time you can just use the equal as an assignment, but when you use them to initialize local variables, you can initialize a local variable in the local command. Then you have to use colon equal. I found myself to actually put colon equal everywhere. It just makes it easier to know this is an assignment versus a comparison. That's what I recommend. But here's a cool thing. You don't have to use the replace command. You can put your table name, field name equal. It's smart enough to know that it's a replace. So let's replace. The this doesn't exist. You use colon. With becomes with object. Few differences. Null, please be careful about null. In Harbour, null means zero length. Nil is what our null is, which is a little weird when you deal with tables because databases, they don't have nil and null. We only speak about nil. So it takes a little time to get used to it. Now in my VFP compatibility project, I am actually making a VFP a null, which is actually the nil. So you can override it if you want to. Ands and or, you have to put the dots around, like you have the T for true, dot T dot. You have to do some of the and and or. That's why I said that some tweaking would have to be done for your code. Alt trim instead of alt. Your variables, they have a new type called static, which is fantastic. The idea is that when you call the function more than one time, it can remember what the value was when you come back to it. So for counters, so you can initialize it to 0 if it's null at first, nil, and then you can increment it. I use that many areas as a trick. You can initialize your local. Date time, they are day-based, not second-based. I created a microsite get time delta in milliseconds, so you can put 2 of the date times, because otherwise you have to deal with the fractions, the floating of seconds. That was got me for me. Strings, we actually have plus equal like in C. It makes it much easier. Instead of your variable equal your variable plus something, it's just the plus equal. Set step on already spoke about. Projects, we are not limited to 16-bit. One major thing I forgot to mention, RDD, replaceable database driver, I think they're called. So by default, it was dealing with the old NDXs, I think, of DBase and Clipper. They added full support to DBF, FPT, and CDX, which I use all the time. But basically, you can replace what kind of database engines is used to store the files. So for example, that's how I made a switch to create in-memory cursors. You can actually also specify how you connect to things. You can specify, like copy a file from one place to another. Well, if you use their virtual file system, like the RDD file, the remote device drivers, you can copy a disk from disk to in-memory, and it becomes like a regular file. Or you can even put a NetIO connection and copy across TCP/IP and use a copy command or open command. It's insane what you can do. But again, you have to tell yourself you have to go into the DBF FPT CDX mode if you want to. And text, it doesn't work with the text merge. The text merge will have to be done afterwards. I use debug view all the time. There's a whole section about it in my documentation. It's a good way of tracing your code. If you want to ship executable but still be able to see what's going on with a debug mode. RDD, here it is. So it implements all of the append, replace, skip, go to. Even some people, I think, make RDD for PostgreSQL, MySQL, and SQLite. Some of them are commercial. I don't know why you would want to do that. That's why we have remove SQL statement, get the SQL statement into memory. I spoke about the hidden. The 2 gig size file limit is gone, even for DBFs. So you go in 64-bit mode, you can have enormous files. Now you're still limited to numbers of records because of the limitation of the standard of the DBF. Although I know there are some RDDs that exist that even breaks this, or you could create your own RDD if you want. Now, once you go beyond 2 gig, you will not be able to open with VFP. I heard they may have some compatibility issue with the CDX files. I never spent the time to verify that, but I think there might be an issue there. There's another vendor called Advantage Database System that also mimics DBF VFPs very closely and has local SQL statement into it. But again, most people go to Postgres MySQL, so there's no need for it. All right. Any questions on these quick items, or should I go further into the GUI and the code, Rick?
No questions.
Okay. I was thinking this is more like a check marks. It's also a good list for myself to keep myself what there is, and I'm going to add to this. The GUI. Okay, so the GUI. Because Harbour is an open source multi-platform environment, and every platform behaves differently in how they handle GUI. Windows, of course, is a fantastic platform for developers because in one way it's not great because it's closed source code. On the other way, it's good because Microsoft made a great job at creating standards for us, UI standards, packaging standards, one way to build an exe, where we know where to install our files. In Linux, my God, you don't know where you're putting your files, where they are. The security system is sometimes infuriating how to deal with. Of course, those who use Linux all the time would know what to do, and they find it obvious. But for us Windows developers, it's kind of tough to go through it. But Harbour has to be a multi-platform environment. So here I listed a few of the most common third-party building tools. So many of them are open source, some are not. 5Win is like the grandpa of all of the GUI exists out there. It is commercial, not very much developed anymore. This is actually created by the person who actually spearheaded the Harbour project. I speak with this gentleman off and on. I use this quite a bit, but it is a little tough to use. It is closer to Fox Pro, but you don't have a form builder. So you have to put in PRG all your add gets and your add says. They have some workaround that you can use some resource builders in C that you can use to do that. I forgot the name of it, but it's not easy to use. And again, it's more like Fox Pro, not object-oriented, but it is commercial. It is heavily used and has some support. Xalier, I didn't have the chance to use, but quite a few people told me they use it. Windows 32-bit only. By the way, for 5Win, Windows completely. Mac and Unix supposed to be under development, but as I said, this is not being pushed anymore too much, so I wouldn't hold your breath on the Macs and Unix. But I had to say it officially, it's there. Xalier, they try to be just Windows 32-bit. It's basically the big competition of Alaska Software's interface, basically, where they actually have things working. It is not open source. There's some open source part, some open source, some of the kernel they don't release. And it is VFP kind of like, doesn't have visual inheritance, but you can have classes attached to your object. So it could help you. From what I read about it, it seems to be pretty decent if you want to go that way, if you want to stick with a pure desktop solution. HBQ, this gentleman I spoke with also quite a bit. The reason I spell the license is not certain. It's tidying up to the Qt project. Now, Qt is one of the most popular GUI framework in the world. Most devices in cars and everywhere else is done using Qt. The license of Qt is a little crazy though. It used to be $25 per month. Now it's $350 per month for commercial use. If you bind in the controls in your program. This gentleman here was able to make it so it is not a bound. It's kind of like comparing the ODBC drivers. You know, we don't bind the ODBC drivers, we do use them. Same with Qt. If you go this framework, you don't bind them. So in theory, you're not bound by the $350 a month license. But you know, as I said, it is a confusing license, not because of the Harbour project, which is open source, but because of the Qt. But you can do some pretty nice interface. Qt, as I said, is one of the nicest and is fully cross-platform. So if you want to go that way, it is a good thing to see. It doesn't have visual inheritance, so you have to do kind of your own classing kind of concept. Harbour Mini GUI, Windows only. It is very active. It is more like Fox Pro again, but it is kind of the grandparents on some of the other projects. It is very popular in South America, but it's Windows only. And then we have this AGM Extended, popular in Eastern Europe and Brazil, open source, quite a bit used as well. But Windows, again, you're locking up to Windows. So if you go to Fox Pro, you stay in Windows. You may want to, and you don't mind, you know, VFP developers, we already know that we have to buy our tools sometimes. We may want to do Auxiliary or HQT. OOG, it's a free open source. It has object-oriented, not the design part, but the usage part of it. It is a subset, a grandchild of or child of Harbour Mini GUI, but they basically added the whole object-oriented design into it. And then you have a HW GUI, which was created by one of the core developers, a Russian developer, who made unbelievable debugging features, a debugger before VS Code happened. It is multi-platform. I know many developers using it, but it is again Fox Pro for Windows syntax. It doesn't have all the snippets. All of the snippet concept are actually handled through something called code block. So you create your snippet code into a memory variable, and you bind that memory variable to your valid event, to your when event, and so on. So again, this is kind of going backwards. Now, here's some exciting things. I think some of you may have actually read in my white page. There are a few projects out there going on. One which is working quite well to actually bring the concept of Electron to Harbour. Electron is the building block of Slack, of VS Code, of Skype, of all of those. So they don't want to be mentioned yet by name who they are, but they are one of the main developers in the Harbour world. And I actually have a few print screens of it. Just got it just this week. So this is codename HBtron, like Electron. The idea is it binds in the Chromium browser, the WebKit, into your exe, or at least the reference to it. It is cross-platform like VS Code is. But the difference is that it runs Harbour code. Actually, it can run multiple of them. They're called drivers. You can, for example, link it to an external website, and the entire external website becomes being played inside the browser. The only thing that you would have advantage of this is that they don't have the back button, and people cannot just hack the address bar. So it kind of makes a desktop app by using a website. It's okay. It's one way of doing it. Or if you think about PHP, where you have a bunch of PRG files, you can actually have HBtron look at PRG files you have locally, and your PRG files are going to have the instruction about what to build on the screen. And when you have a button, when you press the button, it will actually call a function that you create in your PRG file. You're binding HTML buttons to PRG routines instead of JavaScript. Now, you can do still JavaScript, of course, but you can actually have execution of that. Now you can, for now they're doing as PRGs or the pre-compiled, the HRB files. I would probably see that you can actually at one point make it cooked in completely, so there's no need of separate PRGs, but this is in beta mode. Or this is an example, by the way, of one of those, a PRG being executed and deal with the responses. So this is a desktop app. The print button would work. So you have print. This is another example of using, I think, Bootstrap as your UI, but having Harbour code, writing it, running it, building it, processing it. Another example of the CRUD operation, very web-based. Another one here using a CGI. So you could actually have this HB-tron communicate to a CGI app locally. Now, we could, in theory, build CGI apps in VFP, kind of like an ASP, kind of like, and have VFP becomes one of the consuming agents of HB-tron. We could. I don't know why we want to, but we could. But the idea is HB-tron becomes the browser, the web server, and the dialog communication system to an external EXE. Now, that EXE could also be a Harbour program as well, if you don't want to have PRGs. So this is actually really exciting fact and maybe a big game changer for Harbour. When we spoke about what could Harbour be used for, desktop apps, web apps, services, backend daemons, and also microservices, REST API. So this would be a big step towards the GUI side aspect. Let me see. I think that covers the GUI. Any questions, Rick?
Nope, keep going.
All right. Okay, developing interrupt. Let me see for time. Oof, let me be faster here. Please go look at the article. This is how you can create COM objects in Harbour and consume them in VFP and vice versa. One of my first article I created, step-by-step guide how to do it. Very useful. By the way, the Harbour COM object I created, like 64-bit, I would consume them from PowerShell. This was pretty cool. I don't think I would have any questions on here. So web development. All right, this is actually, I will show some code here. This is a good point. I have a whole article about creating web apps in Harbour. I will actually show some code here. Let me see. I have so many of these VS Code. Hold on for a moment. VS Code CG. So in VS Code, you can create something called a workspace. So you can either edit a single PRG, you can edit a whole folder, or a workspace. A workspace is a wonderful way to bind in multiple folders and actually bind in also the kind of configurations you want to do. So like shortcuts, you can have them localized to a workspace. So a workspace is more or less like a project file for the IDE. Let's look. In this particular one, I actually made so I can see a hello world. Where is my hello world? Okay, Echo. This is an Echo program on the web. If I open Echo, this is a web page being created by Harbour, and it basically only echoes when I hit the button here. It's kind of small. Let me make it bigger. We have a request counter, and it basically responds, okay, I built a page. Nothing changes. This is what I typed in my URL. That's all it does. If I look at the source code of it, of the Echo PRG of FastCGI, I basically have a loop. This is called a FastCGI loop. Wait for a request to be done, sent to the server. When a request happens, I'm going to call my onRequest method. I have an onRequest method, and I'm going to output HTML because in this case, this is a method. Actually, this is a good example of a class. So I create an object from a class. In VFP, we do create new of the class, or create object of the class. Here, we call the class name. So every class, I do a defined class called myFCGI class. Let me go to the bottom. Is it here? Oh, here's my class. My class, myFCGI, which is inherited from subclass from the class I created at the level of the library called the Harbour FastCGI class. And I'm going to tell I'm consuming 3 of those methods. I'm going to overwrite 3 of the methods of the parent class. This is a little bit different in Harbour, in the class. The class is, I would say, one of the most extreme differences between Harbour and VFP, and maybe the arrays, but this is the most extreme one. In Harbour, called class, you put your methods, your properties, which they call them data, first without code, or you can have what they call inline code, a single line of code, and then you would define them somewhere else. They have to be in the same PRG, or they can be in an external PRG as long as you include your other PRG in your first one. There are a few tricks to do that. I have a few places where my code was so big, my class was so big, I would split the definition of the class across PRG files, which at least we can do in Harbour. But again, there's a difference between kind of the implementation and the definition of the class. So here I'm saying I'm going to override 3 methods, and this is how I do. I have a on first request, and a FastCGI exe is being instantiated one time in memory, and you can tell, hey, the first time it runs, do this. So you could imagine in here, this is where you open all of your table. This is where you would connect to your SQL backend. Or if I use an ORM, this is where I would create all of my objects that I would use later on for every request. On shutdown, obvious, when the exe is being closed down. On request, this is where I decided where I want to do things. Now, I could have not used this. I could actually put code into my loop, but I want to be clean. So I made a separate method I'm using called the onRequest. Send debug to debug view is the tool I was speaking about, which most VFP developers never heard of. It's a wonderful little debugger that Windows has. So if I put my debugger view here, and I go to the website, hit refresh a few times, and I can see my message from debug view. So you can keep some debugging information even when you ship out your executable. That's the way Windows usually track down what there is. I would highly suggest that you tell what to filter for messages, because if you don't have a filter, you're going to see a bunch of Windows debug messages occurring all the time. But as I showed earlier, you can actually do step-by-step debugging of FastCGI exe. Because I'm in a method, instead of using this, I'm using ::. If I use a single colon, it would be to reference to a method of an object. : is a this. Print, I'm just sending it out. I'm initializing a variable. Like VFP, we can put brackets. Arrays that don't support parentheses. So arrays, you have to use brackets. One of the tricks, you have to work on that. By the way, in VS Code, let me show this to you. It's pretty cool. You go beginning somewhere, Shift All, drag it. You can edit multiple lines. Unbelievable what you can do with this, especially you can align a bunch of things quickly. I got some hotkeys. I created an extension that I can highlight a bunch of things, bunch of pluses, and align all of them in one shot. Hey, I found I have a typo here, client. Okay, my spell checker found the problem. My debug, some more prints, and that's it. Okay, so if I run this, I actually ran it before. I can run in debug mode or in execution mode. And the workspace, this is what I meant by the workspace. You can actually have different paths. This is a fast CGI app. I think I'll show another example. Code block. I mentioned earlier that code blocks are used for scanning arrays. So, by the way, I'm sorry, I like to show my alignments with extra dots here. Function main, I can create code blocks which are like lambdas. So here I'm telling, hey, I want a piece of code which will have two parameters, A and B, and it doesn't make sense here. I want to subtract A from B and A plus B. I'm only explaining that whatever the last statement is going to be executed. A code block can be a single line with a comma, or can be multiple line. Like this is a complex calculation. I've got three parameters. It's like the functions of VFP, but here, you know, parameters, and I can consume them and I can return. The code block then can be passed anywhere, can be serialized. You can transform a code block into a piece of text, can be stored into your database, and then you can retrieve that code block and macro execute it anytime. But unlike the macro execution of VFP, which by the way, Harbour has macro, like we have, a code block is a compiled piece of code, like FXP, which means when you execute those macros, you don't have the performance issue that we have with macro execution in VFP. So it's fantastic for that. Because of this advantage of speed performance, like when I search my arrays, here is an expression. I'm searching an array. This is a two-dimensional array. I have an array called a test. I'm adding rows in this array. I'm adding a sub-array, hello, one, some piece of text, and a number. I'm doing an A scan on the array, and I'm doing a code block search. Hey, find me if the first element of the second dimension array has the word. But you can do matching, you can do searching, you can even do, hey, I want two conditions. The condition is on the first element, you know, the first column and the second column. This is where VFP basically loses it. We are doing an A scan, a two-dimensional array with condition against more than one column. A little tricky to work at first, but my goodness, it's powerful. And because those are code blocks, they are full speed. No delays of macros. Good example, on the repo, by the way, when we spoke about resources, about the resources I mentioned, please go to my repo, and all of the code is available, like the fast CGI. I purposely created for the conference already ahead of time a few sample, like the Hello World, Harbour class, code blocks, all of them are there. And as time passes by, I'm hoping to add a few more. Always thinking about VFP developers, trying to keep in mind that, you know, I'll put some comment as necessary into that. Let me see if I'm really off my track. Any questions at this point, Rick?
Not yet.
Okay, let me then go to a little bit more of a tool that you can use for your development. The local Harbour sandbox. The local Harbour sandbox is one of the fast CGI samples I have for you. I can actually show that a little bit of the source code. Because this is, instead of just a hello world, which is really boring, sorry, it actually has more juice in it. So here's the PRG. So the on requests is a little bit more complicated. We have some calling some other methods. We have a switch. So in FoxPro, we have do case. They have do case, but they have like a switch also. So like in C, you say in the switch a value, a variable, an expression, and it has to match a single value. which is pretty cool and a little bit faster than the do case, because do case, every condition has to be evaluated. Here, it computes one time the expression and then will match it exactly to one of the case switches. On error, I got some displaying schema update. Schema. I have an auto schema updating system, so I create a hash array here where I will put my tables and key field values. I actually speak about how to traverse the hash array like we have in FoxPro for each. We have it in here, of course, in Harbour. We have our select, we have our files. Instead of the create table, it's called db create, although I think you can call create table, it's going to convert it. I had to do some tricks because the code page has been created with DBF, doesn't have the code page branded into it. So if you open up afterward in VFP, it will complain, hey, what code page is this table in? DB use area is kind of like the use. You could use the use command, but I have more control with this. Update structure, for, if, exits. This is very FoxPro-like. The arrays here, even though it's an array which is an array of an array, when you refer to it, you can refer to it instead of one bracket, one, another bracket, another one. You actually can put both of the elements in your reference to a cell. Close DB close area. This is a function I created above. I don't know what else I need to do. We have len. As I said, once for VFP developers, you get to it very quickly. As I said, once you know what you're missing and I highlighted those, it should be fairly straightforward. Now for the website, all right. So this is a small site where I want to, for example, see how do I test arrays. You can create a piece of code. By the way, this is using the Monaco editor of VS Code. So I'm editing source code on the web. Now this is not running on another website. You have to install this locally. So this is installed locally, running on your own local system. So you can call any of your local tables if you want to with any resources. And then you can execute the code that you create at any point, anytime. Okay, there it is displaying. It's a little bit slow on this environment because of conference. And when you are doing this compilation of PRGs on the fly, the CGI apps have to be killed and restarted because of something called symbol tables. It's like a compilation issue. So it's a little bit slower in here, but you can play with code. So let's look at something pretty cool. A default demo. This is the hello world again. I have a hello world. I'm doing a loop. I have a class. In Harbour, if you decide to use things that are not core, you actually have to tell, hey, I want to include what classes are. Now you can create your own master include file where you list all of the includes you want to do, or you make them separately. The Harbour wiki will help you find what includes you should put them in if you need to put them in separately, but it makes your exe smaller. So when we run, we have all the hello world and we have the display of the class. If you want to play with this, you can delete the whole content, hit demo, and it will reinitialize the code for you to a simple demo. So I often use the demo button as a base before I start to play around of any snippet. Now let me go to something cool. Speed tests. All right. I would like to add, actually, let me do that in VFP. I love VFP, but, okay. Sorry, add font larger. So you can see this is simple code. I make 15 character X's, and I'm going to go a million times to loop through it and add the 15 character a million times. So I'm limiting to 15 meg since I know VFP has a 16 megabyte memory variable limit. So I'm going to determine how long does it take for VFP to go a million times 15 character. I know VFP is very fast, but I'm still running. I'm telling you the trick is going to be under 30 seconds, so it's not too bad. But when we see Harbour, you're going to be surprised. So tick, tick, tick. There it is. Oh, actually it was slower because maybe it was the conference software. 24 seconds that it took. All right, let's do the same thing in Harbour. Now, the UI will take a little bit longer because of fast CGI to build the page, but the counter is there. Oh, 1.3 seconds. Let me try a second time. Maybe a little bit slow because of the conference. Sometimes I am under 1 second. Okay, definitely. When the conference is not running, I'm usually under half a second. So here I created a 15 meg memory file. Let me bump this up a little bit. Let me make it bigger. Let me maybe make it 1,000. So we are at 1,000, which means 1,000,000 times 1,000, we are at a gigabyte. And here's a gigabyte. We just appended 1,000,000 times 1,000 bytes. Now, if the conference was not running, I would be sub 2 seconds on the 4-year-old laptop. Again, huge difference of speed. So for web applications, Harbour is a beast. Okay. Let's see. We went through web development, web playground. Actually, the playground. I'm sorry, I went through that. Any questions, Rick?
No questions.
Okay, either everybody finds it boring or everybody likes it. Okay, intro to the VFP Harbour repo. This is basically a project that I started to create to help out as the VFP developers. I'm starting to add like the scan and scan, str trend, case insensitive, things that are obviously missing. And the way you work at it is you have two include files. You either have a version which is Harbour VFP, which means add to Harbour without messing up Harbour things that are useful from VFP into it, but I'm not overwriting the way Harbour does. I would highly suggest you to do that. I know it's hard for VFP developers to let go of some of the VFP ways, but if you already do this whole development, you're keeping all your knowledge base of VFP, all of your smarts, all of your schema engineering that you have, most of your syntax, but you're going to be gaining so much more. So I would highly suggest that. I'm already providing one where I can overwrite. So like the use command, you can actually override it the way it does, because the used command of Harbour by default will only tell if you're using an area, not are using which, if one alias is used. So a few small difference. Probably this is where I'm going to be adding the array equivalent in Harbour. I know the country of Foxborough already has it. Let me see, I have actually a little source code there I can show. VFP tests. So you add in your PRG file, this include file that says, hey, add me to Harbour VFP features. I mentioned you have to tell you're going to DBF and FPT files. I am telling I'm going English way, but you can go UTF way. I'm opening some files. I'm creating a client, invoice, and item file, the one-to-many relationship. And I want to demo and test out. Let me go down the loop. Select client, scan, output the client. I'm going to invoices. I scan all the invoices. I go to the item. I do the same, proving the loop. So I speak about what it's supposed to do and how to test this out. I don't have a GUI, so I'm going to just compile and run in the console of VS Code. And here are basically the output that I have above, and it's respecting the scan and scan. You're welcome to look at what I already have. As I said, this is a burgeoning project. I just started a month and a half ago, approximately, for things that were really missing. I'm just used to using as close as possible native Harbour functionalities. All right. Anything on this, Rick?
Nope.
All right. Last big chunk, the ORM. So Harbour, as I said, does not have native SQL command, which of course was very difficult for me. But at least I had created in the past an object-related model system for Visual Fox Pro. I created a commercial app I have with using it in more than on a 670 table system. I have over 8,000 SQL statements being generated to the ORM. I'm converting it. I converted virtually all of it to Harbour. And it is a wonderful source of actually looking at Harbour source code. So I would highly suggest you reading it or reading the source code if you are down to code. Where is it? Workspace, HBP. This is again kind of like your project file. It speaks about all the files being used. Some of them are PRG, some of them are C files. Be aware, don't call two of the file name with the same PRG C, because the pre-compiler is going to create a file with the extension C, so it will create hborm core.c. So don't make an hborm core.c of your own. You have to be careful not on having a difference. I'm including all these PRGs. Again, this is kind of like your project. I have, for example, something because there's a browse command in Harbour, a text mode browse. It is not very fancy. You cannot specify which fields you want. It can run, but it was very hard to use. So I created my own output in-memory cursor or a DBF into an HTML file, so you can actually see actual code of how to create HTML, low-level create a file, output, add, read an array, pure Fox Pro code like. This is very much, all the Harbour specific are usually HB underscore. So they have the str replace, but when they decided to make it better, they did not want to override the Clipper way of doing str replace. Str replace is kind of like the str trend where you can multiple matching sets. So an str trend is normally one string becomes another string. Str replace is I have a whole collection of strings I want to replace with a bunch of other strings, which is pretty cool. But this is basically, I want to replace this character with this character, that character with that character. This is where you create an array, a hash array in this case, of replacement. Again, one of the wonders of Harbour. So this is one of the examples of the code to create the ORM. Let me show you how the ORM is actually being used itself. One of the project, there are a couple of them, and we're almost done. I know this is a long conference. I'm sorry, guys and ladies. CRUD. I have two examples for this ORM. One is a regular CRUD operation. So I want to add some records. I have a table. This one has an example that hits a MySQL backend and a PostgreSQL backend. There is a README file that explains the object model. I have an object for connecting for connectors. I have an object for making the queries, and an object for cursors. So most ORMs only are object-based. Well, we are xBase developers. So we have cursors, we have tables. So the ORM that we have here will still provide you objects, but still have in-memory tables. So the result of calling the backend, of getting a SQL statement, will return you an object, which is called a cursor object. But the cursor object just described you a physical in-memory cursor like we have in VFP. But you can manipulate it using the object. So it's a hybrid. Get to the table, a table name in the backend. I'm setting a bunch of fields. I'm adding a record. I'm getting a key. That's it. I'm updating this table, CRUD operation. Now, to be a little bit more advanced, I have a table 1. I get a bunch of fields. It's kind of like the select field name as, field name as, field name as. I have a where clause. I have a join clause. Now, because this is an ORM based, this is basically telling, hey, I would like to do all this where, the having, the joins, everything that select statement has basically becomes a method that you build an object. And then when you're ready to actually execute it, you actually call the SQL method. In this case, I'm going to return an array, a cursor. It can also return array or a DBFs, actually a table. And each SQL statement can be serialized, a number that you give. So when you get an error message, it can tell you, hey, your SQL, whatever number you failed, or you can monitor performance issues. You can, of course, see the last SQL it built, or you can actually make your own SQL and override it and do whatever you want. I can build afterwards indexes and do scans. Now, this ORM will create in-memory cursors that have I think they go beyond the 255 field limit count, and your field names can be again longer than just 10 characters. So blow every single features and can support null. I have a whole description about it, and I have an export table to HTML file. So if I actually want to see what it created, because this is kind of what was hard to read, join, here it is. There is a preview option in VS Code, an add-in, to actually view your HTML in your editor. And this is the output that I created from on the fly querying the table. Anthony Hopkins has 2 kids. Claude Monet has 3 kids. And actually also output the result. And of course, because we are in a varchar environment, I want to let you know what the size of these particular columns are. These are varchars, and I think these are 2. Now, another cool thing is, let's say I want to, oopsie. Actually, not in this one. I have another example. So this is basically the regular CRUD. And another example, the last example I'm showing for today, is the ORM to just manage cursors themselves. So this would be like the create cursor we have. In the VFP, I implemented that as an library. You would do your, I want to create a cursor, kind of like a create cursor. I'm going to do all my fields. So I call them called fields. Now, unlike, actually, I think we have that too. We can have auto increment fields, time fields, binary fields, and nullable fields. And you can also specify Unicode fields if you want. And you can see these are long field names, and you can create your cursor. You can call it called append blank, which add record. You have to call this one instead of the append blank if you want to have auto increment fields to be set for you. If you want default values to be set for you, you can actually have that as well. And then one of the cool things is that, okay, I will run this code and it will create a cursor with 100 records. Let me run this. I'm going to run under Ming. You could use Microsoft Studio if you want. So this is going to create everything's a bit slower today. Here's simply the simple file, simple cursor, and the structure I created. So this was not accessing the backend, but just locally. And you're going to see something phenomenal. I'm going to go now and create 1,000,000 records. Instead of just 100, 1,000,000. I'm not displaying 1,000,000 records. In the output to HTML, I can actually tell to limit to only 20 records. And it did that in 1.7 milliseconds. Now, I think this is slower still because of the conference. When I run this without the conference software, I'm under a second for 1,000,000 record. So 1,000,000 records. I can see 1,000,002. All right. let's see. Any questions on this?
Nope.
All right. Final, where to go from here? Please discover, go through it as much as you can. If you can, join the meeting group, the Google group. Feel free to contact me anytime. I'll do my best to answer all of those, especially on the Google group. It will be the best place to do. And it's just fun. It's absolutely fun to do some of those things, but you will have to deal with the lack of visual building tool. That's a little hard to deal with. And that's it for me for today. I know this was a very long presentation. I had no idea how I can cover all this material. So thank you so much, Rick and the conference, for allowing this presentation to be done. I hope you will find it exciting and interesting like I did 3 years ago when I started to work in this. And I try to bring as much of the VFP knowledge I have into this and benefit from this as well. So thank you so much.
Eric, Woody is asking about if you can show one of those form/class designers.
I did not install any of those on my machine.
Okay. Okay, well, there's a Q&A session available after this that Eric will be hanging out in. Thanks for coming.